Well, the FBI is at it again, possibly manipulating vulnerable people with brain development issues into plotting to commit acts of terror. Over the past couple of decades, the FBI has been accused of using their informants to craft terror plots, going as far as providing weapons and explosives, then arresting them in efforts to look like they're doing their job and keeping us safe. Recently, the FBI announced the arrest of a teenager on allegations he was providing financial support to ISIS. This was detailed in an excellent report in The Intercept. And with us now is Murtaza Hussain, senior writer at The Intercept. Thank you so much for joining us, Murtaza. Tell us about this story. This is just another example of the FBI abusing their power, going after vulnerable people. We should all be outraged by this, but tell us the story.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kim. So, as you mentioned, last week there was a young man arrested in Massachusetts on accusations of supporting a terrorist group, in this case ISIS. There was a DOJ press release about it. There were quite a flurry of media reports about it in local and regional news, sort of echoing the FBI's claim. So, I've seen many cases like this. And in this case, this was a young man who was accused of financially supporting ISIS. And it may sound like he's a terrorist financier or a prospective terrorist or security threat. But when you drill down to the details of the case, they're actually quite different from what it seems to be. In this case, there was a young man, he was online when he was 16 years old, and he was befriended by somebody online who claimed that they were from ISIS or seemed to be from ISIS. And in reality, this was an FBI informant. And they developed a relationship over the course of 2 years where they talked about various things, talked about him potentially leaving his home and joining ISIS in a different country. He was not aware that ISIS has been defeated already in its main territories. It wasn't something that he knew about at the time, but this person he was communicating with throughout this period was kind of stringing him along or encouraging him in various ways. And eventually they settled on the fact that he should support ISIS at this person's suggestion by giving them donations of gift cards, like small amounts of gift cards, $25, $45 every few months, something like that. Turns out this person who he'd been communicating with all these years was an FBI informant. And FBI informants are very active in the real world and online. I'm sorry, he wasn't an informant. He was an undercover FBI agent.
Ah,
So he's someone
even
working for
worse.
the, even worse, right? So you can think spending all his time talking to them online, going through these various conversations about his life, about what he could do for this organization with, some support or some encouragement. And he didn't know he was talking to the FBI the whole time. And he was committing a crime at the FBI's suggestion of giving them these small donations of gift cards, which essentially is the terrorist financing that is being talked about in this government press release. So that's bad enough, having a young man, on the internet being sort of groomed or encouraged by an online voice, which turns out to be the FBI. But in this case, he also is not just young, he has brain development issues and neurological issues as described by his father, which have resulted in him not being able to go to school, made him socially inadequate in various ways. And he's being bullied a lot at school at the time that he's also befriending this FBI agent slash ISIS informant or ISIS member, as reporting to be online. So when he turned 18, after 2 years of grooming online, shortly thereafter, a few months thereafter, he was arrested and now, characterized as a very serious national security threat. But in reality, the facts of the investigation don't seem to bear that out. And, it seems very much more likely, barring further evidence coming to light at trial or discovery, that this young man was not a threat. He never was in touch with any ISIS members at all. And the only member of ISIS he ever funded was actually the FBI.
I mean, this is outrageous. It really is. I think about it. A 16-year-old on the internet. I mean, we crack down on perverted people that go after 16-year-olds and try to get them to engage in, let's say, child pornography, what would be considered child pornography, and that is. And we don't go after the child, right? We don't go after the 16-year-old and say, "Whoa, you were committing a plot to distribute child pornography," because it is a crime to send photographs of yourself underage to other people. That would be considered distribution. So we don't go after the child. We go after the person that was baiting them into it. And we say, look at this person was going after these underage people and trying to bait them into, and they're vulnerable and they can easily be talked into things, and you flatter them and you make them feel good, and then they start doing things that they otherwise wouldn't do. But instead, in this case, they're like, oh, let's target teenagers and see if they have a proclivity to engage with terrorists online. I mean, this, if anything, the FBI agent is the one who's guilty, not the 16-year-old. And then they get him when he turns 18. Is that what I'm getting here? So they waited 2 years to finally
Oh
nab him when
yeah,
he's 18 years old?
yeah. So chronologically, that seems to have been what happened because he's been talking to the FBI agent for quite a long time before he turned 18. He was a minor at that time, and most of the funding, quote unquote, or the basically what he was doing is buying gift cards from the PlayStation Store, the Google Play Store, and sending the redemption codes to the FBI at their discretion. And he developed seemingly a friendship, a relationship of trust with this FBI agent online. And this is while he's a minor. And then when he turns 18, they continue talking, and they make all these plans. He's going to come and join them and so forth. But Kim, this is even crazier detail about this case is that this young man, sometime earlier this year, he decides to try reporting this FBI agent to the FBI. So he
Oh,
contacts the
no.
FBI and tells them that, hey, I am in touch with people, or I know about terrorists in the world, and I'll give you information about this, about terrorist recruitment or terrorist plotting, in exchange for cash and immunity. So he seemed to have concocted a very sort of childish plan that he was going to get, as he asked for, $10 million in duffel bags from the FBI in exchange for outing their own informant to them. So he tried multiple times to report this informant, or report this undercover agent to the FBI, and they declined his request of support. They said this is not really actionable for us and so forth, for knowingly that they were the ones talking to him all along. And then not long after he tried reporting them, they arrested him. So I think it speaks
Unreal.
to the level of inadequacy of this young man who's, in many ways being victimized by the FBI, but they were trying getting in his head. And not only did getting in his head fail to actually make him a terrorist in the end, he actually tried reporting it. He tried to engage in counterterrorism against the FBI's own informant. And all our information about this case is from the FBI's narrative. This is not even the defense narrative. It's their own statement of facts framed as positively in their favor as they would like to. And it's that, egregious on its own terms. So
Right.
I think that there was some time when there was a lot of scrutiny of the FBI over these cases because there were a lot of these cases happening. I think I've been covering cases like this since at least 2014, very, very similar cases of FBI manipulation, either online or in the real world. But they've sort of tapered off a little bit. ISIS has become less of a thing. FBI has moved on to other subjects, which they're more
Right.
interested in at the moment. And yet the tactics remain on the shelf because although they're criticized and scrutinized for them a lot, they're still there. And you still see cases like this popping up in regards to this type of terrorism, but also in other sorts of investigations as well too. Like there's a very, potentially unscrupulous people or tactics which are being employed against individuals who often are very vulnerable in this case.
Right, right. Like what we found out with, now they've moved on to domestic terrorism. And like with the Gretchen Whitmer plot, kidnapping plot, we find out that more than half of the people involved were actually FBI informants. And so they were concocting the plan and talking these people who were maybe mentally disadvantaged in some way, vulnerable in some way, talking them into the plot and saying, yeah, you got to do this. And then the person's like, okay, okay. And the big question on the table is, would these people have done all of these things had it not been for the FBI baiting them into it? If this 16-year-old was online and just being online, and maybe he was looking up ISIS or how to join ISIS, however the FBI must have gotten to him, they got to him somehow because he had some sort of curiosity into something, of course, but who knows why he was being curious or looking around. And maybe if he just would have organically gotten into contact with some people from actual ISIS rather than the FBI, he might have said, oh, never mind, I don't want to have anything to do with this. But what they're doing is playing a game of like Minority Report, that movie Minority Report, where they want to catch you. They want to know, do you have the propensity to be a person who could commit an act of terror or fund a terrorist organization or plot a kidnapping scheme against a sitting governor? They want to see if you have the propensity to do this. And so then they bait you and talk you into it. And it's like, in the real world, if somebody isn't, what would be the chances that somebody would actually bait these people into these sorts of plots? What we want the FBI to do is to use the informants to say, hey, there's this group and they are plotting something, and we're uncovering the plot that they've come up with. We don't want the FBI actually coming up with the plot. And then in certain cases, like the case of Sammy Osmakak, which he was arrested for, he was plotting car bomb. He wanted to bomb a nightclub, set off a car bomb, use an assault rifle, wear an explosive belt, all of these things, and they caught him in advance. And it turned out the FBI actually gave him the weapons. I mean, they were fake, but they gave him the weapons, and they were like, "Here you go. Now go in. Okay, now we got you." I mean, it's just insane that this is what they're using our money, our tax dollars for, is going after people who are not actually terrorists, but are being talked into it by the FBI. So, what are some of the other cases that you've looked into that are similar to this, just so that people can get an idea?
There are so many cases over the years that have covered very similar to this. One particular stands out to me. It's a case from 2008. It's referred to as a Fort Dix 5 case. And very notably, the lead prosecutor, or the prosecutor general at that time, was actually Chris Christie. He was very closely involved. It took place in Fort Dix, New Jersey. And it was a group of young men who, similarly, over the course of several years, informants were introduced to them not online, because online was not as much of a primary social space in 2008 as it is today, but in their real life. And they befriended them, they got to know them, and they tried to coax them again into committing crime or talking things about it. And they weren't interested, actually. They weren't really into it. And the FBI informant who I actually spoke to and about the case after, he told me, and this is on video actually, in a documentary you can look at the Intercept. He said that I've tried telling my FBI handlers all the time, these guys are not terrorists, nothing's going on here. What do you keep sending me to talk to them again and again for? And the FBI said, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Just keep going back there, keep going back there. After befriending them for a number of years, they were undocumented immigrants from Albania. They liked going to the shooting range. He said, hey, I can sell you some AK-47s so you can go to the shooting range and enjoy them anyways. So they committed that crime. And then after that, they were charged with a whole bunch of terrorism stuff, which they had no idea about at the end of the day. And effectively, these guys who had a pizzeria, they're just normal guys. They were put in jail and accused of all these things. They had no idea about it. The judge at the trial actually said, this is quite remarkable to me, he said, well, there's not a lot of evidence that these guys actually knew anything about terrorism or had anything to do with it, but it didn't bother the jury, so it's not going to bother me either. And he sentenced them to life in prison. Many, many
Wow.
cases like this. Yeah, awful, awful cases. The guys are still in prison. I really encourage people to look that up. I could go on and on about more cases like this. But I do think, Kim, you raised a very interesting point and a very important point, that it's about also budgets. So the FBI and other agencies, to justify their budgets, they need to have a steady stream of cases that will substantiate that. But also,
Yeah.
if you're investigating somebody like the Fortix 5, or this case we're talking about today, if you invested already a year, 2 years, looking into somebody, you're surveilling somebody, you're talking to somebody, that's a lot of money. That could be hundreds of thousands, could be millions of dollars you've invested in labor, equipment, other resources to do this. At the end of it, if you don't generate a case, maybe it doesn't look that good. Whereas if you
Yeah.
can show you had a case at the end of it, you've shown a return on investment. So there is a institutional pressure to generate cases. People are rewarded institutionally for arresting people and generating prosecutions, not for walking away from cases, even if the person may have been innocent. So, I think you have to think of it that way. Because I was looking at this case and I was wondering, why do you need to arrest a mentally, you know, challenged or handicapped young man who, I think in your heart of hearts, you have to know was not a threat, was not capable of being a threat. I did not know any terrorists except for the FBI undercover agent they were talking to. But I think that it's because it generates good PR. If as long as you
Yeah, of
don't deal
course.
with it more deeply.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like they're doing their job. Oh, we stopped a terrorist plot, or we stopped somebody who's funding terrorism. And it definitely keeps them employed. And ultimately, I think that's the motivation for many of the people inside of almost every company and every department, is people want to keep their jobs, right? So they need to look busy. They need to look like they're producing something. And this is how they do it. They say, well, let's go get the bad guys. I guess this is how we can't find the bad guys, so we'll just make some bad guys. Um, And now they've moved on from the 9/11 terror type terrorism, the actual, radical or what, from foreign radical type. And now they've moved on to domestic radicals, right? And they're claiming that even parents at school board meetings could be potentially labeled as terrorists. I mean, the definition will continue to widen as they need jobs. They need to still be going after people. And that's what's so frightening about this is it's kind of that old adage, like I didn't say anything when they went after, the Muslims. I didn't say anything because 9/11, but now they're going after the school, the parent at the school board meeting, or the Trump supporter, who thinks that the election might be rigged or something. I mean, it's just, this is where we're at,
Well,
unfortunately, unless
you
we
know,
stop it somehow.
the consistent problem is that the supply of terrorists, whatever type of terrorists they are, has never been sufficient to meet the demand for them. There's a lot of
Right.
demand politically for them, but there's not enough supply. So when you have a problem like that, you need to generate more supply. And you can generate sort of organically or inorganically by coaxing people along or finding people who really are, vulnerable due to immigration status or criminal history or financial reasons or mental or physical incapability, and getting those people along. Because a lot of
Yeah.
the vast majority of terrorism cases, I would say, are people who would have been incapable or unwilling to do something like this outside of, a lot of external support and a lot of coaching that they receive over a long period of time. And I think we all agree that stopping legitimate threats to national security is a legitimate function of the
Right.
FBI and other institutions, but we don't want them to essentially concoct cases to
Right.
harm people who were not otherwise a threat, and also, expend resources which should be deployed at more constructive purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a great read. I definitely encourage people to read up on this because this is a genuine problem that we're having in this country, and we need to figure out a solution to how we get the FBI to focus on things that we'd prefer them to focus on. So it is written in The Intercept by Murtaza Hussein. The title of it is "The FBI Groomed a 16-year-old with Brain Development Issues to Become a Terrorist." Again, you should add again, right? They've done this before and they're doing it again. Murtaza, thank you so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kim.